The shoe was still laced. That was the detail that stopped Detective Raymond Hollis cold on a February morning in 2019, when a demolition crew tore open a plaster wall inside an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of Genevieve County, Missouri, and found it resting in the cavity like something placed there deliberately. A woman's Oxford shoe, brown leather, size 6, one small brass buckle still fastened at the instep. Laced, preserved by the sealed darkness for nearly 3 decades as the world outside that wall changed beyond recognition. Inside the wall, time had simply stopped. Hollis stood in the dust and the cold and looked at that shoe for a long time before he said anything. Because that shoe didn't belong to a woman who had walked away. A woman who walked away takes her shoes. That shoe belonged to a woman who had no say in what came next. That woman was Doretta Mae Caulfield. She was 31 years old. She was a licensed practical nurse at St. Francis Medical Center in Cape Girardeau. She was the mother of a 7-year-old boy named Lyle, who had his mother's dark hair and her habit of humming while she read. She disappeared on a November evening in 1991, 28 years before a demolition crew in Genevieve County found a single laced shoe inside a wall and handed Raymond Hollis the first solid thing anyone had found in nearly 3 decades. To understand what that shoe cost, what it meant that it sat in that wall for 28 years while a boy grew up without his mother, you have to go back to that November. You have to go back to who Doretta Caulfield was and what she was building in the small, careful way that people in that part of Missouri built their lives in the autumn of 1991. Southeast Missouri in the early 1990s moved at a different pace than the rest of the country. The interstate had come through years before, but the smaller roads still carried people between towns the way they always had, slowly, past soybean fields and old limestone bluffs, and the kind of roadside diners where the coffee came in thick ceramic mugs, and the same waitress had worked every Saturday shift for 15 years. Genevieve itself was the oldest permanent European settlement west of the Mississippi, a fact the town wore quietly. French colonial architecture stood beside hardware stores and farm supply shops. Neighbors borrowed tools and returned them. Nobody locked their doors in the middle of the day. Doretta had grown up 40 miles north in Perry County, the second of 4 children raised by her father, a river freight foreman, and her mother, who taught Sunday school at the Methodist Church for 22 years without missing a single week. Doretta had been a careful, steady student, the kind who wrote her notes in the margins of her textbooks and read them again the night before exams. She had wanted to be a nurse since she was 12 years old, since the year her younger brother Earl broke his arm in a fall from a grain elevator, and she had watched the hospital nurses work with a calm precision that seemed to her like the most competent thing a person could be. She earned her LPN license in 1984. She was 24 years old, and she was proud of it in the quiet way her family was proud of everything, by not making a fuss about it, by just showing up every day and doing the work. By 1991, she had worked the night rotation at St. Francis for 4 years. Her colleagues knew her as the nurse who always checked on the patients one more time before her shift ended, the one who remembered which of the older patients had children who hadn't visited in weeks and made a point to sit with them for 5 extra minutes. She kept a photograph of Lyle in the breast pocket of her scrubs. She checked her car locks twice before walking away from the parking lot. She was saving money in an account at First Missouri Bank, small deposits, consistent for Lyle's schooling. Because Doretta Caulfield thought in decades, and she was not a woman who left things to chance. She had plans for the Thursday before Thanksgiving. Small plans, the ordinary kind. Pick up Lyle from her mother's house in Perry County, stop at the Ega for a turkey and 2 cans of sweet potato filling, be back in her apartment on Merchant Street in St. Genevieve by 6. She told her colleague, Sharon Meeks, that she was looking forward to the weekend. A quiet one. Nothing special. Just her and Lyle and the good smell of something cooking. That Thursday morning, Doretta Cofield clocked out of her night shift at St. Francis at 7:12 a.m., walked to her car in the hospital lot, and drove away. Nobody who loved her would ever see her again. The sequence of events on November 21, 1991, was reconstructed piece by piece over the years that followed, and it went like this. At 7:30 a.m., a service station attendant on Route 61 in Perryville reported seeing a brown 1988 Pontiac Bonneville, Doretta's car, turn east off the highway toward the county road that led toward her mother's house. He remembered it because she'd pulled in, looked briefly at the air pump, and then driven on without stopping. At 9:15 a.m., Doretta's mother, Elsa Cofield, called the St. Francis nursing station asking if Doretta had worked a double. She hadn't. She was supposed to have arrived an hour earlier. By noon, Elsa had called Doretta's apartment. No answer. She called Sharon Meeks. She called the one neighbor she knew on Merchant Street. She called the Perry County Sheriff's non-emergency line and was told to wait 24 hours, which is what they told everyone, which is the instruction that has haunted 1,000 cold cases in this country. At 4:30 p.m., Lyle asked his grandmother when his mother was coming. Elsa Cofield told him soon. She said it twice. The next morning, Doretta's Pontiac Bonneville was found on a county road 6 miles east of Stade Genevieve, pulled off onto the gravel shoulder in a way that suggested the car had been driven there and parked deliberately, not broken down and abandoned. The driver's side door was unlocked. The keys were in the ignition. On the passenger seat, in a paper bag from a Perry County bakery, was a small loaf of pumpkin bread with a card tucked inside that read, "For Lyle, from Gran." Her purse was gone. Her coat was gone. Her right shoe was gone. The left one was still on the floorboard of the car, knocked under the seat as if she had struggled or been pulled. Sheriff's deputies from Stade Genevieve County processed the vehicle and found nothing in the early passes. No blood, no signs of violence visible to the naked eye. The lead investigator, Sergeant Dale Pruitt, noted in his initial report that Doretta may have left voluntarily, that there was no evidence of foul play, and that it was possible she had arranged her own departure for personal reasons. Elsa Caulfield stood in the gravel beside that Pontiac and looked at her daughter's single shoe on the floorboard and said something she would repeat for the next 28 years. "My daughter did not leave her shoe." It was the most important sentence in this case. It took almost 3 decades for someone to listen to it. Sergeant Dale Pruitt was a competent officer. In fairness to him, 1991 was a different era. Forensic technology that would later transform cold case investigation, genetic genealogy, touch DNA analysis, national databases with mass comparison capability, did not yet exist in any useful form for a county sheriff's department in southeast Missouri. What Pruitt had was interviews, tire casts, and the forensic capabilities of a state lab that was underfunded and backlogged. He worked what he had. In the first weeks, 2 individuals came under scrutiny. The first was a man named Gary Tomlinson, a former neighbor of Doretta's who had been cited twice for domestic disturbances in Perry County and had made at least one comment to a mutual acquaintance that people later described as inappropriate. Pruitt's team interviewed Tomlinson 3 times. His alibi for November 21st, he had been at his brother's property in Scott County all day, verified by 2 family members, could not be broken. He was eliminated. The second person of interest was a man whose name Pruitt was unable to share publicly because he was never charged. Identified in case documents only as a male acquaintance of Doretta's from her years in nursing school. This individual had made contact with Doretta's mother twice in the months before the disappearance in ways Elsa described as odd. He was interviewed once and cooperated. His whereabouts on November 21st were accounted for. He was eliminated. Meanwhile, Elsa Caulfield was doing what families do when the official investigation stalls. She made flyers and drove them to every diner, every feed store, every gas station between Perry County and Ste. Genevieve. She called the state tip line every Thursday for 6 months, logging each call in a spiral notebook. She sent a letter to the Missouri Attorney General's office in January 1992, asking for a review of the case. The letter was received and acknowledged. Nothing changed. Lyle went back to school that December with a note from his grandmother explaining that his mother was away and would be home soon. It was the kindest lie she could think of. In April 1992, Sergeant Pruitt told Elsa that the investigation had reached a point where new information would be required to move forward. There were no new leads. The case would remain open, but active pursuit would be suspended. Elsa set down the phone. She did not cry. She opened her spiral notebook to a fresh page and started a new list. The case went cold on a Tuesday afternoon in April 1992. Outside, it was the first warm day of spring. The years have a way of burying things, but Elsa Caulfield was a woman who dug. By 1995, 4 years had passed. The flyers in the diners had been replaced by new laminated sheets that Elsa drove out personally every time one was torn or faded. The Ste. Genevieve Herald had run Doretta's photograph twice on the anniversary of her disappearance. Lyle was 11 years old, and he had stopped asking when his mother was coming home. He had learned, in the way that children learn the hardest truths, to hold the question somewhere inside him where it would not show. By 1999, Sergeant Pruitt had retired. He was replaced by a newer generation of deputies who knew Doretta Caulfield's name the way they knew other old case names, as a file in a cabinet, a photograph on a board, part of the institutional memory of the county. A new investigator named Detective Carol Ferris was assigned to review the case briefly in 2001 and found the same dead ends that Pruitt had found. She noted in her review memo that the single shoe recovered from the vehicle had been preserved in evidence storage but had never been examined for trace materials beyond the initial check. That note would matter later. The Pontiac Bonneville had been released from impound in 1993 and returned to Doretta's estate. Elsa had driven it for 2 years before she couldn't bear to anymore. By 2000, it was gone. The house on Merchant Street where Doretta had kept her apartment changed tenants 3 times. The IGA where she was going to buy a turkey for Thanksgiving was torn down in 2003 and replaced with a Dollar General. The reward poster that Elsa had posted in the window of a hardware store in Perryville had faded to near white by 2010. But the owner had never removed it. He told a reporter years later that he kept it up because someone should remember. He had never met Doretta Caulfield. He just believed somebody should remember. Lyle Caulfield turned 30 in 2014 and drove to Ste. Genevieve on a Sunday in November and stood on the county road where his mother's car had been found. He stood there for a long time by himself. Then he drove home to Cape Girardeau where he worked as an electrician, and he called his grandmother, and they talked for an hour, and neither of them said anything that they hadn't said 100 times before. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, cross-referencing records, verifying facts, tracing the lives of real people who deserved better than what they got. If you want us to keep uncovering stories like Doretta's, take a second to like this video and subscribe. And leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. It means more than you know. Now let's get back to what finally changed everything. In the summer of 2018, a man named Gerald Harpe Sr. died in a nursing home in Jefferson County, Missouri, at the age of 79. He had lived the last 8 years of his life in a room with a window that looked out onto a small courtyard. He had no regular visitors. He had been a widower since 2002 and had 2 sons, one in St. Louis, one who had moved out of state years before. He had owned a property in Stace, Genevieve County, a farmhouse on 40 acres that he had purchased in 1988. When he died, the property transferred to his estate, and by early 2019, the estate had arranged to have the farmhouse demolished to prepare the land for sale. It was in the interior wall of the southwest bedroom of that farmhouse that a demolition worker named Paul Eckert drove a sledgehammer through the plaster on the morning of February 4th, 2019, and found what was behind it. Paul Eckert had been in demolition for 14 years. He knew what you found in walls: insulation, old wiring, mouse nests, occasionally old newspapers used as insulating material. He did not expect what was in the cavity of that southwest bedroom wall. He found the shoe first, resting on a ledge of old timber framing, brown leather Oxford, buckled, laced. He set it aside, thinking it was construction debris. Then he saw what was behind it. He backed out of the room and called the Stay Genevieve County Sheriff's Office from his cell phone on the front lawn. It was 9:14 in the morning. His hands were not entirely steady when he dialed. Detective Raymond Hollis arrived at the property at 9:52 a.m. He was 44 years old, had been with the department for 16 years, and had reviewed Doretta Cofield's case file twice in his career, once when he was first assigned to the department, and once in 2015 as part of a county-wide cold case review that produced no new results. He knew her name. He knew her photograph. The State Forensic Unit out of St. Louis arrived by early afternoon. The scene was processed with a methodical care that the original 1991 case, conducted in a different era with different tools, could never have achieved. Samples were collected. The shoe was secured and sealed. 4 days later, the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab confirmed what Hollis had already known from the moment he stood in that demolished room. The remains were human, female, and had been in that wall for an estimated 25 to 30 years. The recovery of preserved